We are here with the Reverend Dr. Jia Starr Brown. Reverend Dr. Jia, thank you so much for your presentation a couple weeks ago, and we're so glad to be able to have this follow-up chat, pulling out some of the finer points of your wisdom. Thank you for being here.
Mhm. Oh, it's my honor. It's my honor. It was a blast to be able to share my voice and some of my thoughts with your community, and I'm looking forward to this conversation now.
Yeah, thank you. Same here. So, to start us off, I'm wondering if you can speak to how you spoke with us about anti-racism education, and I'm wondering how that can connect to young people. How are youth experiencing this conversation in the midst of our cultural leanings towards task-based pressure that you talked about with us, as opposed to taking one's time and being thorough in forming relationships? How are youth engaging with this topic?
It's so funny because every time we think about youth, the majority of us think about them as if they're kind of, on another planet, right? Aliens from another planet. And I will say, as a mother of five with teenagers, they do tend to be kind of like on another planet sometimes, right? But really, they're not that far from us as adults. We sometimes kind of we underestimate and over coddle our youth in assuming that they are in this kind of bubble that's over here and unable to see what's happening in the world today or even to process, right? And so that's the first thing I want to say is that youth are humans. They're human beings that are able to see and observe and recognize what's happening in the world. As someone who in education has done quite a bit of work in providing early childhood education curriculum as well. Even as very young, children are able to recognize feeling and emotion. You know what I mean, and these sorts of things. And so, as young people are growing and they're becoming teenagers and young adults, that sentiment hasn't left. And so, the first thing I would say is when we think about how to speak to young people about anti-racism education is one is to recognize that they're not so far from us, that young people need the same things that we need, which is space to be able to process, what's happening in the world, space to be able to discuss it, and to wrestle with what's happening. These are, if we stick with this mindset that youth are the future leaders of tomorrow, then it behooves us to kind of pour into them today. And so, what does that look like, right? Well, we teach the way that we were taught. And so, if we as adults were taught to not talk about race, to kind of stay silent, to only talk about the big rocks, right? These sorts of things. And these are the things, the tools that we're teaching our young people. Now, the funny thing is whether or not we talk about it around our dinner tables doesn't mean that youth are not exposed to this. With social media in 2024, social media off the charts and engagement with, they're in school setting, right? I mean, they're hearing about what's happening in the world. So just because we're not talking about this at our tables doesn't mean that they're not being exposed to this, to what's happening. And so, if we teach the way that we were taught, our hope then, if we were taught to not talk about it, then we may not be talking about it with our young people. But the challenge then is young people then are not talking about it. They're learning, they're not learning the tools they need to be able to talk about it effectively. They're not learning some of the critical, measures that are needed to be able to really process all of the nuances that are happening in this conversation. And so part of that, if we have been conditioned as task-based to just kind of check the box,
Mm.
right, then that's what we're sharing, that's what we're passing along in this kind of generational gift that we're passing along. The reality is that we gaslight our youth, right? When we
Mm.
don't talk about it, then we gaslight, right? As if it doesn't
Yeah.
exist, as if there's this fairy tale land, but they're very perceptive, right? About what's happening and what's going on. And so we have a responsibility, not just to the world, but to them. To really address the things that are happening right in front of their eyes and to give them language so that they can actually articulate their emotions and their feelings as they're moving through.
Yeah. Yeah, that strikes me as really salient and important. And you talked about, you just said having those conversations around like the table, right? And I'm thinking too about the safe and brave space that we hope churches are for our young people and how important it is to be able to have difficult conversations there too, because if we're not engaging this and the youth are having the conversations elsewhere, we're communicating either that it doesn't exist, as you said, and I wonder also if we're communicating maybe it does exist, but it's not a safe topic, like it's not a topic that we're going to engage with here. It's too political, it's too risky, it's too scary, whatever. But that's a problem, right? That's a really problematic way to engage with this because the youth then sort of receive these different messages instead of saying, okay, these are my safe adults that I can talk to about these challenging topics that I'm hearing about everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
what
Because
that's
exactly,
right. Yeah.
exactly. It's kind of like I was leading a another course for the UCC last week on implicit bias, and I was talking with them about this idea, white majority folks in the class, and I was saying that we all have biases, right? And so here's this idea that if we don't say it, right? I mean, especially whiteness, right? There's this belief that like if we don't say it, then people will think it doesn't exist, right? If
Yeah.
we don't talk about the biases we have, but the reality is, it's like, no, we know they still exist, right? We know that the biases are still here. Just because we're not talking about it doesn't mean that I'm assuming that if you don't say that you have biases, you don't have any. I'm just recognizing that you're not naming what
Right.
I'm already able to see, right? And so the same thing is with our young people is we assume if we don't talk about it, right? Maybe here's one of the thoughts. If we don't talk about it, maybe the message we think we're sending is that race doesn't matter, right? That race shouldn't matter
Yeah.
in some of these conversations. But really, that's not the message that we're sending. And exactly what you're saying is that young people are intuitive, brilliant beings created by God. And so recognizing, like you said, not that these issues don't exist, it's just that the spaces that are not, these are just not safe spaces to talk about them in,
Yeah.
right? And this is the reason why people, honestly, the reasons why people are leaving the church, particularly young people, is because there's gaslighting happening, right? Questioning our reality when what's happening in the world is not being talked about in the church, right? Then they're recognizing that they're not getting equipped in the ways that they need to be able to address these issues. This is why what's happening around in our country, around our college campuses right now with the protests, right, is because people want to talk about these things, and we're not. I'm a Gen
Yeah.
Xer. I was taught that we don't talk about politics, we don't talk about religion, right? I was especially remember when you're dating. I don't know. Do you remember it was like this whole thing was like if you're dating, you don't talk about politics, and like these are these things, and so we kind of send these messages. But
Yeah.
now I'm Gen X and I have kids, right? And so telling them not to talk about certain things can actually endanger them,
Right. Right.
right? It can endanger them.
Right. And we talk about the mental health crisis of young people right now, and that is not to be diminished. It is a total mess. And at the YMI, we talk about that a lot. We just had an in-person presentation last month on this. But
So
if
good.
we say it's not safe to talk about this, anti-racism work, for example, we're also saying, oh, so we can't engage with this tougher stuff. What else can we not engage with? Youth who are questioning their sexuality, gender identity, youth who are struggling with mental health. It's now like, okay, how many times are we going to turn a blind eye and in what areas? Because this will be intersectional eventually, right? This is a conversation that will cause youth to retreat, 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 and that is not the healthy response to how to lead young people. So,
Right, because
yeah,
they're going to
yeah,
get it somewhere,
yep,
right?
that's
And like
right.
they're going to get it somewhere. They're going to get the conversation, they're going to get the tools. And so
Yeah,
here we have an opportunity to be able to contribute We're not the sole influencers of young people's formation, but we have an opportunity to be a vital part of that formation.
Yeah.
Whether we contribute or not, it's going to get somewhere. But here's an opportunity for us to be able to contribute to the formation and the shaping and the processing of these dialogues. But really, what it looks like, the truth is that we're the ones that are afraid to talk about it, not young people,
Yeah.
right? We're the ones that don't want to talk, that are uncomfortable talking about some of these things, and then we kind of want to pass these things on. But our young people are in different generations where they have access to information, so much quicker speeds than we did.
Yeah.
Right. And we have a responsibility to keep up with the pace and to respond to that, especially because one of the things I appreciate what you lifted up is we're talking about the church and what the church is meant to be, what it has been traditionally, has been kind of this pillar, especially the Black church has been kind of this pillar in the Black community, where whether or not you were a member of this church, you knew that this was a safe haven to be
Mm.
able to go and get what you needed, whether it was voting or a flat tire or groceries. This was a space of refuge, right?
Mm.
And this is kind of, and now we're, 40, 50 years later, right? Even 30, 40 years later, and here we are, and people are leaving the church in droves because that need still hasn't been met.
Yeah.
And our young people are looking for it. So we do have this opportunity to be able to have real conversations and chat about it. But part of that begins with us.
Hmm.
We have to interrupt, right, the stagnancy that we've already experienced in regard to how we talk about things and what we talk about. It starts with us
Yeah.
and recognizing where we have been cut off, or where are the pieces that we need to unlearn. We have to kind of begin to really examine what's going on here so that we can ensure we don't repeat some of these same problematic conversations with our young people. We have to
Yeah.
start with us. It's not about picking up like a facilitator guide, curriculum guide, and just like going through the things. Our emotions, our biases are going to seep through, even through our instruction and our education. We've got to start with taking a look at what's happening in here so that we can provide a transparent and vulnerable learning experiences for our youth.